Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 143 of the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Jeremy Salkeld. You may also know me as EnclavedMicrostate. This time I'm on the other side of the whole podcast thing. I'm the interviewer this time. And with me is Dan Noodles. And, if you'd like to introduce yourself and what we're going to be talking about today.
Hello, my name's Dan. I go by Dan Noodles here on Ask Historians. I'm a master's candidate at the University of North Texas, where I study Austria and the Napoleonic Wars for my professional work. So now we're going to talk about sort of the basics of Napoleonic warfare, and especially one of the things that most interests me is how different it is from 18th century warfare. Because I think we live in a pretty technological, materialistic society. So when you have this massive transformation in warfare that takes place without any accompanying technological change, I find that very interesting. So one of the things we're going to be looking at here is the way everything from the bottom up in warfare completely changes almost with the Napoleonic and French Revolutionary periods immediately before.
Okay, so in order to know what changes, we need to start with, where we change from. So what happens really before the French Revolution in terms of how warfare happens?
At sort of the base level, at the very foundation of everything is in the 17th and early 18th centuries, most of the great powers in Europe are able to sort of achieve what Clausewitz calls this complete internal unity, which in most cases means the building of an absolutist state, the most famous of which being Louis XIV's France. But most other great powers follow in the following century. And at the core of this sort of absolutist project is a social contract, more or less, in which the people more or less give up most of their political voice. Most don't have pretty much any role in directing affairs of state. And in return, they have very limited and highly irregular duties towards the state. So stuff like military service and taxes are pretty carefully circumscribed. They're not being, raised and lowered and making arbitrary demands on people without specific cause. So the way this manifests is the French aren't really able to raise taxes as much as they would like for the 7 Years' War and their part in the American Revolutionary War. So these campaigns are funded almost entirely on credit, which would have no negative repercussions whatsoever. Next example I have on hand, Austrians aren't able to adjust their finances at the height of the 7 Years' War enough, and eventually they have to disband 12% of the army while they're fighting this incredibly long and hard struggle with the Prussians under Frederick the Great, just to keep their ends and means balanced. And the reason Frederick is able to pull out through this war, and with his finances mostly intact, he doesn't make any big changes to the tax structure without consulting prominent taxpayers, is more or less he robs Saxony blind. He invades at the very start of the war in 1756, and over the next 7 years of fighting, money that's just been extorted pretty much at gunpoint from Saxony it makes up somewhere around a quarter to a third of all his financial receipts, alongside subsidies from the British and regular taxation. So this is sort of what underlies the warfare of the 18th century, this limited ability to draw on the complete resources of the state.
Right. So, we've got this situation where you can't really extract all the resources available to you in an effective way. How does this affect the way in which war is fought then, if it does?
Yeah, the big impact of this on warfare is it forces rulers to undertake more limited aims compared to some of the potential reasons we can prosecute wars now with our much greater access to resources and material. These are fundamentally subsistence economies in Europe. Some places are getting more advanced with their use of capital and like finance, but at the core of, say, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, most of Germany and Italy is still subsistence economies. And in that context, the possession of territory is sort of the main determinant of wealth and resources available to the monarch. And the way this directly impacts military operations is it brings about a great focus in siege warfare, because the fortresses that are studied around their territories control that region, because a force based there can deny the enemy any ability to get productive use out of the land. This is sort of a strategy that goes back to the classical period. During the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans set up this fortress at Decelea, where they use it as a base for raiding into Attica and denying the Athenians the ability to farm around their city. It's sort of a more manpower efficient way of burning down everything in Attica, like they did during the Archidamian War prior to that. But the thing about siege warfare is that it's very time consuming, and in that context, it requires very secure lines of supply, because you're going to be sitting in one place for a long time, and a large army that can reduce a major fortress, especially in the presence of another army, is going to require significant amounts of supplies that can't be extorted from the territory immediately surrounding it. So being able to securely supply a besieging army is really critical in 18th century warfare. The priority for 18th century commanders is being able to take this territory by siege, generally with a minimum of losses, because these armies have very difficult times replacing soldiers that are killed in battle or desert or suffer from disease. So being able to keep their losses to a minimum is pretty important. In the context of siege warfare, what they do is they give you bargaining chips for negotiation, because the way European rulers think of territory at this time is sort of fungible. You can trade them back and forth. Nowadays, it would be unthinkable to trade a slice of the United States in order to get a slice of Canada. But in this period, it's very a la mode. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, after hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and wounded in battle, the Prussians and the Austrians come to a deal of exchanging the territories that they have in order to basically recreate the status quo at the beginning of the war. So at the end of the war, Frederick the Great, after beating the Austrians in the Battle of Berkersdorf, he's able to lay siege to the fortress of Schweidnitz in Silesia, the province that starts this. All the Austrians are trying to get it back, and after he captures it, there's still another piece of Silesia he hasn't got at the County of Glatz, which is sort of the best entry point over the Bohemian Mountains into Silesia. So he still doesn't have that. But what he does have is a large chunk of Saxony that his brother, Prince Henry, has taken after the Battle of Freiburg. He doesn't yet have Dresden and the rest of Saxony, but he still has something to bargain with. So at the Peace of Hubertsburg, he's able to trade that piece of Saxony that his brother is occupying for Glatz and Silesia, and able to restore the status quo through that negotiation. And for the most part, during these wars, survival is not really at stake for most of the major powers. The 7 Years' War is perhaps an exception, because the Allied powers arrayed against Frederick and Prussia were potentially seeking to partition the monarchy. So the Russians would get, say, East Prussia, the Austrians would get Silesia, the Swedes would get a slice of Pomerania, the French wanted the stuff along the Rhine, Cleves, and mostly Cleves. But for the most part, all these monarchs were going to stay on their thrones no matter what happened in the war. If they were, one of the major powers, minor powers could get partitioned, but even then they could be compensated.
Prussia being sort of the awkward middle power, I suppose, both geographically and sort of hard power-wise. So we've got this sort of high-level situation here of the strategic and operational things, but I mean, what about the armies themselves? How do the absolutist armies function? What are they like?
Generally, when campaigning, the armies of these 18th century states would form like single wholes, comprised of infantry, artillery, and cavalry. And this combined arms approach is absolutely crucial. So you sort of have an army defined by the presence of all three arms in it. And generally, you would have, say, one single army for a theater of operations. There is some experimentation with detached corps or secondary armies, but in the main, it's about unitary armies in the theater. And these armies function as part of, almost as a single body, where they form a solid line of battle, one battalion next to another, next to another, next to another, in a solid line. And where this line is ruptured, it poses a grave threat to the whole of the army, where if it's broken in a single point, it can unravel the whole battle line. And this is what underlays a lot of the most famous successes of the Prussians during the Silesian Wars. First, at the Battle of Hohenfriedberg, during the second, Frederick is able to get a breach in the Austrian line just in one place, but that's enough for 10 squadrons of dragoons. The Bayreuth Dragoon. I am not able to say dragoons today. They're able to ride into this line and then roll up both lines of the Austrian infantry, one after the other, up and down, so to speak. And then later, at the Battle of Kesselsdorf, his great general, the Old Dessauer, Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, he leads the right wing of the Prussian army against the Austrian and Saxon positions, and only his right wing is actually in contact with the enemy, but that's enough when it breaks through to destroy the whole Austrian Saxon army at Kesselsdorf. The next famous example is Rossbach in 1757, where the French, trying to get around Frederick's flank, he's able to outflank the flankers, and with a cavalry charge and just a couple battalions of infantry to their front, able to completely smash the French at Rossbach. And this defeat becomes so humiliating to the French that later Napoleon actually says the fall of the French monarchy that we all associate with the revolution and chopping off the king's head actually begins at Rossbach in 1757. And then immediately after Rossbach, you have Leuthen, where Frederick marches all the way from Saxony into Silesia. And with the Austrians deployed, facing him, he's able to conceal his army behind a ridge and leading them in two columns. He sort of crosses their T, marching these two columns around the Austrian flank and then turning in place to roll them up from the Austrian left. So with the integrity of the battle line being so important, commanders have these sort of set piece deployments to bring the army, from marching order into battle line. And there's all this experimentation during the 18th century trying to find, the best way to do so. The way Frederick preferred to do it is called the alignment march, where he would form the infantry in two lines, or in two columns rather, of platoons, so that when the army, reached its place on the field, these platoons could simply make a quarter wheel in place and form a complete line of battle. Other armies used what's called the processional deployment, where the columns would be led onto the battlefield, and then they would make a right turn to form the line, and then wheel into place. And then between the Second and Third Silesian Wars, Frederick experiments with what gets called the deployment, which is more of a fanning out of columns into their line of battle.
The way that these things deploy, I mean, it does seem a little bit unwieldy, but I mean, presumably there is good cause for this.
Well, like I said, these armies are very dependent on being able to have each tactical unit mutually support each other, because if they're caught by themselves or in the flank, then they can be easily defeated. So being able to put the army on the field in this, compact, solid formation is really important. And, when an army is caught, mid-deployment, it can be very bad for them.
I can imagine. So, so it seems as though, at least when we were talking about, say, Hohentriebburg, that you've got the way that these armies are set up and deployed on the field, the focus is more on actually affecting a breach in the enemy line than necessarily what you'd normally expect, which is a normal outflanking, sort of certain exceptions, mostly Frederick's notwithstanding. Generally, did the way that battles were fought have kind of an effect on how effectively you could actually fight the enemy?
Well, in terms of outflanking, doing so with 18th century armies was pretty difficult, because doing so would require you to detach a part of your army to actually do the outflanking. And when it's detached like that, it can be very vulnerable to a movement from the enemy. So being able to outflank the enemy is something that definitely contributes a lot to victory where it's possible. But this is sort of getting ahead of ourselves. But during the revolutionary Napoleonic period, you have major organizational changes in the armies that makes them more resilient and more able to undertake, these kind of envelopment movements. Another part of the difficulties with these linear armies is being able to pursue and bring the enemy to battle. One of the big things in this period, especially towards the earlier end, they get better at it during the 7 Years' War, but even then, an enemy who doesn't want to fight a battle can mostly remain in their position, almost impregnable. The big example of this from the 7 Years' War is Frederick the Great in 1761. He's surrounded on all sides by the Russians and the Austrians, massively outnumbering him. So a short way away from the key fortress of Schweidnitz, he establishes a fortified encampment at Bunzelwitz, which the Austrians and the Russians are kind of at a loss of how to attack. They draw up plans, but they're never confident enough to try and execute them to attack Frederick in his position. And even if you do get an enemy, even if you are ready to attack an enemy in their prepared position, like an entrenched camp, they can always just leave the battlefield while you're still, trying to go through these complex deployments for your army. So, you're trying to, do this processional deployment, and the enemy just gets into column of march and hightails it out of there. So it's a major difficulty in using these armies is that if you do get like an advantage on the battlefield, like say you have superior numbers, then the enemy doesn't have to fight in that situation. So you'll only get these major confrontations that produce great results, these decisive battles, when both sides feel they have a good enough advantage to fight a battle, which is a very fleeting situation because, if one side thinks they have an advantage, the other side probably thinks they have a disadvantage. So being able to get that sort of Goldilocks spot is very difficult. And during the 18th century, like commanders, they're not stupid. They recognize that their armies have distinct limitations, and they experiment with trying to mediate these, get around them. So, especially towards the end of the 7 Years' War, there's a lot of experimentation with new ways of subdividing and organizing the army. In 1762, at the Battle of Burkersdorf, Frederick is able to reorganize his army into these sort of semi-independent columns that are making multiple axes of advance against the Austrian position. They're still very much united in space and time, but their geography, they're sort of separated, and they're able to pull off this sort of concerted attack on the Austrians there. And at Freiburg, his brother Prince Henry does, something quite similar, forming up the army into several semi-independent divisions in the same place, but these aren't like strategically independent, divisions like we would later see, but tactically they're formed up and put on sort of separated tasks that together work to force the Austrians from the field at great loss. And then on the French side, you have a whole lot of people who are experimenting with new ways of forming up the army. So sort of the division as we know it sort of has its origin in the experiments of Marshal de Broglie during the 7 Years' War, who commands the French army against the sort of composite British, German, Prussian army in Western Germany. And, the French, they've suffered several losses by the time de Broglie is in command. So he has to, figure out how to improve the army. And one of the things he does is he organizes it into several quote-unquote divisions, which we wouldn't necessarily recognize as their mature form, but this allows the army to march onto the field towards the enemy in several columns, which allow them to deploy into line much faster than the traditional methods the French had been using. Marshal de Saxe, who had led the French during the War of Austrian Succession, also experimented with more combined arms tactics. Although a lot of the French were kind of weird in that they wanted to bring back pikes to a degree. Flaired was another prominent French officer who advocated deep columns for shock assaults, and he also played with the idea of reviving the pike. But during the later 18th century, more French officers would put out theoretical writings trying to address the limitations of the army during this time. The most famous of which is probably Guibert, who is famous for his general essay on tactics, where he proposes, among other things, more independent battalions, where previously in the 18th century, the battalion is sort of simply a building block of a larger line, usually usually within like a left wing or a right wing or a center, but still very much just a component. Whereas Guibert advocated for battalions that are able to undertake more independent action, greater scope for the commander to act in accordance with the overall mission of the army. And Boursier authors a book about mountain warfare, where he advocates organizing the army into several independent divisions for the purpose of crossing mountains at several passes. In order to do this, of course, each division has to be able to stand on its own against the enemy, which means having combined arms in these main subunits of the army. And sort of this helps presage the developments of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period.
So we've kind of alluded several times to what's coming up, the whole revolution. But right before we do, pikes. Why?
It's perhaps not as ridiculous as it seems at first blush, although nothing much really ever came of it. So on the battlefield in the 18th and 19th century, you have artillery fire, you have cavalry with cold steel, and infantry sort of combines, these aspects in that they're able to attack both with firepower and with the shock of cold steel. And what had been observed through, many, many campaigns over the century is that the attack with the bayonet is often what decides a tactical action. When a body of troops is facing another and they see them rush towards them with bayonets lowered, if they can't stop them with fire, they have to flee, more or less. The ability of someone without armor, without a shield, to stand and fight, in close quarters against an enemy that has sort of the psychological advantage of being on the attack is very limited. So one of the things that I found really interesting that I found here on Ask Historians is, there's a discussion like maybe a year or so ago, about the actual engagement in combat of, say, medieval armed formations. And one of our users brought up the fact that in one of the knightly orders, there was no shame attached to a person who didn't have armor from fleeing the approach of the enemy. So clearly this lack of armor or its presence has a major effect on how willing troops are to stand around getting stabbed. So the idea is that when you give troops a weapon whose only function is to stab, and which absolutely excels at this function, because a bayonet on the end of a musket, it's a 6-foot long spike, more or less. Well, someone comes around with an 18-foot long spike, what are you going to do? So the idea that a charge of pikemen in this period could be successful is, in the abstract, not so ridiculous, because the charge of bayonets in this period was often a major feature of the action. Another big aspect of it was the French idea of their own sort of national character. This becomes big during the Revolutionary period. Again, the idea that the French are one of the hot peoples of Europe, with hot-blooded in that sense. They always want to attack. They want the glory of the decisive assault. And the idea of standing around, shooting, and mechanically reloading, it's sort of a cliche at this point in 18th century warfare literature to describe soldiers, or the ideal of a soldier as a machine or an automaton. But there is very much the idea that the ideal soldier in German armies like the Prussian is to, stand around and shoot and reload to the point that the Prussians develop this technique to the point where, when other armies are shooting, 2 or 3 rounds a minute, they can theoretically get up to, 4 or 5, maybe even 6. So in contrast to that, the French see themselves very much as the cold steel, the white, they call it the white weapon, armée blanche. So the idea is that the pike is better suited to the French character than the musket.
Yeah, that hot blood helps with cold steel, and that cold
So it
blood
seems.
helps with hot lead, I guess. Yeah. But, that was evidently the path not taken. So, the path that was the French Revolution. The French Revolution is obviously massive for many reasons, but homing in specifically on warfare, what does the French Revolution do to that?
Probably the biggest impact of the revolution in the Napoleonic period, at the foundational political level, is the development of what they call the well-ordered police state. Far more coercive power and far less acknowledged limits on the state's ability to mobilize resources. Rhetoric is one thing and reality is another, but it is illustrative that the Levée en Masse of 1793, stated forthright that all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the army. There's no acknowledged limit that, this is an army for volunteers, or that you're only going to be required to fight under specific, delineated conditions. This is an army that can demand everything of its citizens, more or less, at least in theory. And what this does, the most immediate impact is fast increase of the numbers available on the battlefield and on campaign. The French army, at the beginning of the revolution, had sort of dwindled from a peak during the 7 Years' War, has sort of dwindled to about 150, 160,000, and the political roiling in Paris had led to a lot of overturn and desertion in that. So you have a series of calls for volunteers and subsequent levies that result in an army of, say, 150,000, more than quadrupling to perhaps 700,000 effectives over a couple of years. And actually integrating all these new troops into existing formations is a pretty complicated process. They go through a number of stages of trying to filter in the new revolutionary volunteers and conscripts, sort of a multi-stage amalgamation. They call it the amalgame, whereas at first the revolutionary volunteers and conscripts are predominantly in secondary roles. The famous victory of the revolution at Valmy, most of the troops there are from the old royalist line army. So, chew on that maybe. But later, in 1793 and 94, they're able to first organize their armies into what they call demi-brigades, sort of the quote-unquote politically correct version of regiment in the French Revolutionary context, where they'd have 1 battalion of Royal Line Infantry and then 2 battalions of Republicans. Well, there isn't that political distinction, but raised during the period of the Revolution. And then they're able to, cycle more and more of the revolutionary forces through camps of instruction, where they come back and they're able to pass on what they learned to their other comrades. So they're able to eventually integrate bodies of royal period troops into each company of French infantry. So the distinction between them almost doesn't exist anymore. So by that point, you're looking at a huge and now much more uniform army in comparison to anything that had come before. And employing this much larger army on the field, it requires sort of a new organization. And the division sort of evolves and fits and starts over the initial period of the Revolutionary Wars. But in its mature form, they incorporate, all three arms of the service into one body that's able to, fight independently for the better part of the day. And because it's able to exist sort of independently of the rest of the army, this sort of facilitates a broader march column, or a series of columns on a much broader front, which facilitates the requisition of supplies. Because an army's ability to supply itself is basically the result of, basically the area it's marching through and the key provisions that are available in that area. So when an army's approach is marching over, say, a 30-mile front in 3 columns, it has the ability to access, much, say 3 times as many supplies as an army marching in 1 column with a 10-mile sort of theoretical frontage. And the knock-on effect of this is that it enables much more sort of complex operations, what they sort of called combinations at the time. Being able to use these multiple independent forces in concert over the course of battle, rather than the 18th century style of, lining up everyone and then going into battle. Another big part of what makes this much larger army manageable is you have much more sophisticated structures of staff, command, and control. The French had sort of implemented the seeds of a general staff before the revolution, but was disbanded during that time. Lack of money, suspicion by the Republicans. It's a very complex issue. But during the revolution, they're able to rebuild more complex staff structures at the divisional and army level. And expanding the canvas to Europe at large a bit here, one of the really interesting things during this period is you see the fusion of a professional literature for war. There had been military journals before, but several of the biggest ones are founded in this revolutionary Napoleonic period. Several of them become important in the development of the Prussian reform movement. One of the big ones is called Neue Bellona, or New War, so to speak, founded by a Hessian officer, and this becomes larger in the Prussian circles. The Archduke Charles, during his reform of the army after the defeat of 1805, one of his things is to implement a professional journal for the Austrian army. So you have this more professionalized officer class who are, more dedicated to the service than they had been even during the time of Frederick the Great. The development of sort of a scientific approach to war that can be consistently studied and trained for is something different than what you see during the 18th century.
How do they fight now that you've got this new organization that allows them to spread out further? When it all comes together.
And the French system really starts to crystallize during the middle period of the War of the First Coalition. You see the emergence of a distinct tactical system, which is distinguished from the 18th century style by sort of 2 main connected phenomenon. For the first, there's a much more fluid use of formations on the battlefield. So rather than units forming up in set piece deployments, 2 lines of infantry with cavalry on the wings, these units are able to get into the fight almost as soon as they're on the field in more flexible formations. So, for example, you'll have a column approaching the battlefield, and, for example, the leading regiment of the divisional column will sort of fan out as a body of skirmishers, and that will cover the brief deployment of that division into line. You see this at the Battle of Auerstadt during the Napoleonic period, where Moran's division, I think, when it approaches the battlefield, its lead regiment shakes out as a mass of skirmishers, and once the battalions are deployed in a sort of line of columns, each of them puts forward a screen of skirmishers, so that advanced guard is able to shift onto the flank to cover that wing of the army. And one of the things Guibert had emphasized is to divorce this sort of processional march order in the column of approach from the actual use of the tactical units on the battlefield. So what you have is battalions and regiments that are able to sort of pivot and move and wheel independently to undertake assaults and attacks on the enemy from multiple directions, like on the field of battle. They're much more independent than tactical units had been earlier. And a big part of the effect of this is that a battle, rather than being concentrated on breaking the enemy line and rolling them up, so to speak, it becomes much more focused on the use of reserves in battle. So the ideal is to have as much of the enemy army facing a small portion of your army. So, for example, you'll have your forward battalions. Each of them will have a screen of skirmishers, and most of the fighting and dying is going to be done by that screen. While your main force of your infantry is out of the range of fire. So, because one of the things that sort of counterintuitive, but sort of makes sense when you think about it, is fresh troops are much more effective than those who have been in action for a considerable period of time. The combat effectiveness of a unit doesn't decrease linearly with casualties. Like, even if a unit wins an action, just from having been in action, it's going to be much less effective. People get tired, their muskets get fouled, their lead balls going down the barrel will leave a coating of lead, and this will gradually build up and make it harder to load. There will be fouling from the burning powder, most of which doesn't actually burn. Some 70% of the powder charge is still solid after it's been ignited. So that builds up in the barrel. So even on that tiniest level, there is a very definite decrease of effectiveness that comes from just being in combat. Another part of this is reserves are much more effectively employed than they ever had been before. So during the 18th century, armies, in their linear formations, a unit is basically stuck in its place in the line. Whereas in the French Revolutionary Napoleonic period, reserves are more centralized, and they're more effectively employed anywhere along the battle line. This is something Clausewitz noted as one of the big changes during his period, is that reserves can be used almost anywhere under any circumstances. So what this means is that even if you do drive back the troops comprising the forward battle line of the enemy, you still haven't won, because as long as the enemy still has reserves to sort of retrieve that situation. So like you're not going to win the battle until you've chewed through those reserves. Like, there isn't this sort of quick, easy way to victory that Frederick and the other Prussians had sought. And part of the goal of this economy of force, of keeping as much of your army in reserve as possible, is the idea is that battles are going to be determined by who has the strongest reserve at the end. Because once the enemy's reserves are all committed, then you'll have this huge fresh force that can be used to break the line when they have nothing left to respond, and you can get that sort of unraveling effect that you had seen during the 18th century.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, I suppose, that kind of the stereotypical image of these quite different conflicts is that what one seems, the 18th century stuff seems quite, for lack of a better word, conservative in how sort of structured and so on everything is, but that actually the revolutionary sort of warfare was, in a sense, conservative, and that you tried to conserve.
Right. The differences lies in why they're conserving, so to speak. One of the big reasons that the 18th century rulers are so conservative using their forces is the difficulty of replacing these troops who have long experience. The standard enlistment period in the British Army, for example, was for life. You got a bigger bounty enlisting for life, and that's one of the big draws for people going into the service. And it was supposed to take several campaigns for an infantry soldier to reach their peak effectiveness. So when they have these sort of carefully circumscribed military and financial duties to the state, as I alluded to earlier, replacing troops lost in battle is very difficult. So they have, what the French Revolution does is that it sort of takes away that sort of foundational conservatism. So the use of troops can be determined, by the practicalities of trying to win a battle rather than trying to conserve forces for the sake of economy.
This is the sort of the hard mechanics of battle. Well, how typically would one of these play out?
So generally, armies would approach the battlefield in several columns, usually separated by as much as a day's march between them. And one of the big things that differentiates it from the 18th century is that there is no sort of deliberate deployment of forces. They're able to get into the fighting pretty much as soon as they get on the field. So the advanced guard of the army will have its screen engaging that of the enemy, and then more forces will pile on, and then more will pile on as the column gets closer to the actual point of fighting. And eventually this will sort of coalesce into a set piece engagement where but even then there will be considerable forces that are yet to be engaged that will be able to come into action during the course of the main battle. So what this does is it sort of turns the strategic positioning of the armies directly into their sort of tactical positioning.
I suppose, could you give an example of this, say, in one of, Napoleon's early battles or something like that?
For example, at the Battle of Auerstadt, which technically isn't one of Napoleon's battles, this was fought by the Third Corps under Marshal Davout. he has a corps of 3 divisions, and each of these divisions is sort of in column along the road back to the city of Naumburg. And each division is getting thrown in as it becomes available. Like, there's no time where he collects all his divisions and lines them up to fight the Prussians. They're being committed to battle as it progresses. So it'll seem like the Prussians are finally getting the upper hand, and then he's able to get his 2nd division on the field just in time, and then the Prussians are getting ready for their main attack, and he's able to get his 3rd division on the field. And the thing is, you have this sort of continual commitment of forces throughout the battle, and also what this leads into is, like in the case of Auerstadt, this is part of a sort of complex operational battle, so to speak, whereby Napoleon, with his main force, is fighting a Prussian detachment further south around Jena, while Davout's corps, because the army has been attacked on his left. He was formerly, in the advance guard, but because the army is sort of rotated in place, towards his left, he's now on the right wing. And what that right wing is doing, with his stand at Auerstadt, is he's sort of cutting off the retreat of the Prussians. So you have this, major strategic envelopment that comes across as the result of the strategic disposition of the forces. So in the case of the Battle of Jena, you can sort of conceptualize it as Napoleon making a sort of frontal attack against a body of Prussians, while Davout's corps is cutting off their retreat, coming around their flank to cut off their line of retreat towards Freiburg, I think was their next destination.
So, that, I think, segues quite nicely into kind of the next level up. Operational art. It seems like the French Revolutionary Napoleonic period is where the concept emerges. How does this kind of early operational art operate, for lack of a better word?
So, previously in the 18th century, there had been a pretty clear distinction between strategy and tactics, especially because of the importance of deployment and a solid force on the battlefield. You have the maneuvering of the army, sort of on the big map, so to speak, where you'll have the relative positioning of the armies, but then after their deployment, it's not as connected to their actual strategic position. But the advent of these sort of independent combined arms formations that are able to undertake their independent action, across geographically separated areas, you have increasingly this sort of blurring the lines between, what's a tactical maneuver and what's a strategic maneuver, because they become deeply connected. A force that's on your left strategically can become a force that's, attacking your left on the battlefield tactically quite easily in the Napoleonic period. So what this does is it leads to much more complex, operations that lead into very different sort of battles than you had seen in the 18th century. I've already mentioned the Battle of Jena just now, but one of the campaigns Napoleon considered one of his finest was in 1809. He was facing a coalition of Austria and Great Britain, but Austria was the only one on the European continent, in a theater that would directly face France. They're the British on the peninsula, but we'll ignore them for now. their initial offensive had been in Bavaria, south, and they come in contact with the French south of the town of Regensburg. And during this campaign, over the course of 5 days, Davout, like he had at Auerstadt, he faces the main force of the enemy army. And because of the core system's resilience, he's able to fend them off while Napoleon wins a series of 4 major battles. At the Battle of Augsburg, he sort of splits off the southern wing of the Austrian army from the main force under Archduke Charles to the north, and then pursuing them further south and to the east, he defeats them again at Landshut. And then, because he's south of them now, he is now in a position to roll up their left wing, which is running north to south. So this sort of, you have this transition from a tactical breach to a strategic envelopment back to a tactical flank attack when he leads his force north towards Eckmühl, where he's able to force the Austrians from the field with this sort of outflanking movement, and then finally drive them north over the Danube by forcing them out of the city of Regensburg over the bridge. And then this battle didn't turn out as well as his previous ones, but the Battle of Bautzen during the spring campaign in 1813, he's defeated the Allied armies at Lutzen in Saxony, and he chases them into the region called Lusatia, and they're positioned behind the River Spree, and he has his main army directly following them, but he also has a substantial force under Michel Ney, who's crossing the Elbe River significantly north of him at Torgau, and from this position they're able to come down on the flank of the Allied army behind the River Spree. So, and then it doesn't turn out as well as it could, because Ney is not the most refined tactician, to say the least. And he, instead of trying to cut off the Allied line of retreat, he keeps, throwing his forces against fortified high ground position on the Prussian-Russian left. But this does exemplify the sort of connection between strategic maneuvering and tactical action. And then the most famous instance of this is probably Waterloo, because everything about Waterloo is famous now. But while the Duke of Wellington is making his stand against the frontal attack of the French, Blücher is leading his Prussian army from the city of Wavre, which is almost due east of Wellington's position. So when he arrives on the battlefield, he's immediately in a position to attack Napoleon's flank and try to cut off his line of retreat. And this is one of the big things that decides the course of the battle at Waterloo, because everyone likes to bring up the attack of the Guard against the British line at the end of the battle. But the thing is, this attack is only made by 8 battalions of the Guard when there are some 22, I think. And the reason only some of the Guard is able to get in is because Napoleon has had to feed in Guard battalions all day to defend against the Prussians, who are threatening to roll up his flank. So this sort of enveloping attack plays a decisive role in several of the major battles of the Napoleonic period. And, this is one of the things that furthermore distinguishes it from the 18th century, is that, whereas a flank attack in the earlier period would be able to completely unravel the enemy line in a cascade of battalions breaking and fleeing. If anyone's played Total War, it's a bit like, at the end of the battle when you have the chain route effect, as, each unit becomes demoralized seeing its neighbors flee. this doesn't happen so much in the Napoleonic period because of the utility of reserves in this period. The main function of these flank and enveloping attacks threatening the enemy's line of retreat is more just getting them to commit more and more reserves towards, fending off this threat to their line of retreat, rather than, smashing and rolling them up.
Yeah, we've got these kinds of operational maneuver moves into individual tactical engagements. I mean, obviously these are cases where maybe a single or two flanks are threatened. I mean, particularly the line of retreat. Do we get kind of complete encirclements? Does that play out essentially the same? Is it just kind of a more extreme form of what happens at, say, Regensburg or Bautzen? Or is this kind of an extra risky thing that's only occasionally attempted when you're opposing generals, especially unfortunate?
I see what you did there. But yeah, the biggest example of this sort of operational envelopment taken to the extreme is definitely Napoleon's first campaign as emperor, actually. When he's been preparing for his invasion of England along the Channel coast, but when the English are able to enlist the help of the Austrians and the Russians to form the third coalition, Napoleon has to redeploy his forces to face them and indefinitely postpone the invasion of England. So, in this situation, the Austrian main army is going into northern Italy. They have a large secondary army, though, that invades Bavaria and southern Germany ahead, and this army is awaiting reinforcements from the Russians. First, one army under Kutuzov is coming of about 40,000, and then a second army under Buxhausen is going to reinforce after that. So Napoleon is able to exploit this sort of premature move by the Austrians into Germany. The army is about 72,000 strong total, nominally under Archduke Ferdinand, but he has secret orders to obey the advice of his chief of staff, General Mack. Yeah. So they begin this move into Germany, and Napoleon is able to shift his Grande Armée from the Channel coast to the Rhine quickly, and then first thing he does is he has the Fifth Corps under Marshal Lannes and the cavalry screen under Marshal Murat. They begin this feint towards the Black Forest in Germany, which leads Mack to believe that the main force of the Grande Armée is going to approach him directly, from the west to the east. But instead, what Napoleon does is he crosses the Rhine further north and then swings behind Mack's position, crossing the Danube between Donauwörth and Ingolstadt. And so by doing so, he cuts off Mack's army from Kutuzov's Russians who are approaching. And then the thing is, he also has to cut them off from the Austrian armies to the south. Small army under Archduke John in Switzerland or thereabouts, and the main army under Archduke Charles in Italy. So he has two corps under Bernadotte and Davout. They go east to block the Russians, while the rest of the army encircles them, cutting them off from the south and the north with the corps under Michel Ney, keeping them on the south bank of the Danube. And so as a result, pretty much the main force of the Austrians in Germany is totally encircled, cut off from their allies to the east and to the south. and with the core in the north, there's pretty much no escape for the main force of Mac's army. It's kind of funny because while Archduke Ferdinand is not a man of any great military reputation, and he had only like a limited role in like actually leading the campaign, he's able to lead one of the few forces that actually escapes the subsequent encirclement at Ulm, along with Karl Philipp zu Schwarzenberg. They're able to escape this encirclement and regroup in Bohemia, but the rest of the army is more or less captured intact in this and a few subsequent operations. So, yeah, and completely encircled at Ulm, the army would be absolutely destroyed if there was an actual battle that took place. So instead, the army surrenders more or less as a whole, which leads to the famous episode where Napoleon requests to see the commander of the army, and unbeknownst to him, Mac is like right in front of him, so he introduces himself as, in fact, I am the unfortunate General Mac, which leads to every historian for the next 200 years calling him unfortunate at every opportunity.
Well, I mean, it's just so quotable.
And then the Allies are able to pay Napoleon back in his own coin, so to speak, at the Battle of Leipzig, where in 1813, for the fall campaign, there had been three main armies for the Allies: one in the north around Berlin, one further in the east under Blücher in the vicinity of Breslau and Silesia, and then one in the vicinity of Bohemia under Schwarzenberg. So when reinforcements from the Russians arrive in the form of reserve army of Poland under General Bennigsen, these armies like all close in on Napoleon from three directions. And the furthest left column of Austrians is cutting off Napoleon's retreat out of the city of Leipzig, while the main armies approach him from the south and the other armies from the north and east. And the thing is, like, they're not able to like capture the whole army as Napoleon had done at Ulm. What happens is the Austrian column in the far west, on the far left, under Gyulai, is, by threatening his line of retreat, it forces Napoleon to commit a corps he had been intending to use as a reserve during the main battle. So he's not able to do that now that the Allies have him encircled and are threatening his line of retreat. So when he's not able to get that one corps he needs for the decisive attack at the end of the battle, after so many of the Allied reserves have been committed, he's more or less lost the battle by that point. This is on the 16th of October, and while the corps he commits to protect his line of retreat, it's able to fend off the Austrian column. The thing is, the Austrians and the Russians and the Prussians are going to get some more than 100,000 reinforcements in the next day, and Napoleon is only going to get like 14,000 when he only has like one corps coming in to reinforce him. So at that point, he's completely, he's shot his bolt at that point, and this is one of the things that he definitely deserves the most criticism for in his career, along with some other things. But he maintains this army at Leipzig, in this very disadvantageous position when there's no hope of a victory after that point.
So, yeah, not his finest hour, by any means. So, we're going distinctly from bottom up this time, so up from operational art. I mean, what's the grand strategy of all this? And why get involved in all this fighting? What for?
One of the most important aspects of the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars is the way it affects like grand strategy, and there are sort of two archetypal strategies that sort of define, Clausewitz's idea of the two kinds of war. There are wars where you fight to get a better negotiating position. This is sort of emblematic of the earlier 18th century wars with their limited aims. But then there are wars to make your enemy militarily and politically helpless. And this is what we now today classically call the strategy of annihilation. Rather than just making a conflict, too expensive for the enemy to pursue, the ideal is to destroy their ability to pursue it whatsoever. And generally this means like the defeat of their main army on the field of battle. And what this does is that this emphasis on destroying the enemy's army, it produces more flexible approach to strategy. Whereas in the 18th century, the predominance of siege warfare had led to this sort of concentration on secure lines of communication. Commanders in the Napoleonic period were much more willing to, temporarily sacrifice their communications to get into a position to land, an annihilating blow. The example that Napoleon milked, for most of his political career, is the Battle of Marengo, which, a very close fought battle, and an extremely risky one because Napoleon had led his army over the Alps directly south behind Austrian lines. So if he had been, truly solidly defeated on the battlefield of Marengo, he would have been in a position where it would be almost impossible to retreat securely because he'd have to, he'd be retreating, as an extension of his wing, to the right, which is a much easier position to cut off for an enemy army than a line of retreat behind the center of the army. But also he'd have to cross the Alps again, but with the enemy army directly behind him, trying to pursue him. So these commanders are taking much bigger risks now because they believe the payoff will be worth it. And another example of this pattern of the Allies, adapting Napoleonic techniques is Blücher during the campaign of 1813. Napoleon is positioned behind the River Elbe in Germany, and Blücher leads the crossing of this river at Wartenberg, where there's a combat that gives one of his corps commanders, York, his sort of noble victory title. Forever after, his family is entitled to be called York von Wartenberg. So after he crosses the river, Napoleon marches forth to sort of cut off his retreat, his line of communications over the river. And instead of retreating, towards, his line of retreat, Blücher rather, retreats further into French territory because doing so will give other Allied armies time to close in on Napoleon and bring him to battle at Leipzig. And then, once that battle is won, then it won't matter that his communications had been disrupted for a while. So you have this, greater willingness to undertake, the risk of destruction in order to inflict it on the enemy. And sort of the bottom line of the revolutionary Napoleonic period is this massively expanded scope of war. Whereas previously, like I alluded to, the duties of the people towards the state and the army in times of war were generally carefully circumscribed. Now war had started to overtake all of society, involved, which leads, several major scholars to label it the first total war. There's definitely a lot of debate about applying that label in a pre-industrial period, but there's definitely very strong and convincing evidence that this represented a major step in intensifying, warfare. And a less important, but I think still definitely interesting effect of this is it makes Napoleon sort of the last of the great warlords, so to speak. You had previously, people like Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan or Temujin, Frederick the Great, Charles the 12th. These people who had combined, complete political and military power, directly leading their armies while managing the state. And this had almost been like a default for much of human history, where pretty much the sole duty of the leader of the state is war and war making. Now, in the Napoleonic period and afterwards, afterwards, not including Napoleon, it's no longer practicable for the king to be his own condottiere, as Clausewitz phrased it. For the most part, you don't have rulers and heads of state personally leading the armies on the field anymore. The Battle of Solferino in 1859 did see all three national contingents led by their monarchs, on the field. But the less said about the military leadership of Napoleon III and Franz Joseph I, the better. There have been scholars writing about the presidency of FDR in America who believed he was the last one to sort of master the office of president, because he had expanded his powers so much that it had become impossible for any successor to really master the office and see what it could, and use it to its full potential. And Jeffrey Parker, one of the famous early modern historians, extended the concept to Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. You're sort of the last person to master the Habsburg monarchy in its original guise, because it had expanded too much for his successors to really have full command of it. He had the advantage because he was able to directly oversee the sort of expansion of its scope. But afterwards, it was no longer possible. And I think Napoleon is very much in an analogous position in terms of sort of classic warlord sort of office that previous rulers had exemplified. He's able to, display this incredible, mastery of strategy and operations and statecraft, but as a direct result of his own actions, it becomes greater than any one man can control in the future, which leads to this greater sort of separation of political and military power into separate professional castes.
Yeah. So I suppose that kind of wraps up the grand descriptive part of this, but we still have time for me to ask some slightly more open-ended questions to some extent. Now, we've talked a lot about kind of what changes between the 18th century and the revolutionary and later period. I suppose one kind of conceptual question is how much of what changes is fundamentally just an evolution of what had happened before? Or was there something just really very different about the revolution in itself that made these changes happen?
I mean, little of column A, little of column B. I've alluded to previously about a lot of the experimentation that takes place with the art of war during the 18th century, especially in the period of the 7 Years' War. But at the same time, there are definitely precedents in the 18th century But there, in terms of like actual practice, it's not until the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period that these sort of seeds actually blossom and grow into something that has like real, cash value on the battlefield. There's, you do have elements of sort of technical changes that have been experimented with in the pre-revolutionary period that meet these, massive changes in politics and ideas and theory and organization that take place during the revolutionary period. So it's the combination of these things that I think produces something, greater than the sum of their parts, I think.
And I suppose continuing with this idea of changes and continuities and continuous changes, we talked a lot about revolutionary changes, and I guess looked at through Napoleonic practice. Essentially is the Napoleonic period, if we say kind of from 1801 or 1805, whatever you'd like to start it at, essentially just a continuation of the revolution, or is there something a little different there as well?
John Lynn is like one of the preeminent scholars of the French Revolutionary Army, and one of my favorite articles that I've read for a long time from him is called "Towards an Army of Honor," and the idea is that like monarchical armies, like those of the 18th century and the Republican Army of the French Revolution, are sort of like different animating values behind them. The revolutionaries, they emphasized sort of civic virtue, fulfillment of duty of the citizen to the state as sort of the underlying value of the army. And what Napoleon does is that he's able to sort of synthesize these two sort of opposed approaches to like military values and morale. Whereas the 18th century armies, they're very much defined by the pursuit of honor, glory and renown by the soldier. Napoleon, his soldiers are animated by both virtue and honor, so to speak. And this sort of emblematic of his overall approach, where he's synthesizing the changes in technique and detail that had been experimented with during the 18th century with the political and psychological even changes of the revolutionary period.
We've mainly talked here about France, which is logical. I mean, it's where the whole revolution happens. It's not called the French Revolution for nothing. But evidently, of course, we do see these sorts of changes in the way that warfare is fought later on. We've talked about 1813 and Blucher's essentially doing what Napoleon did with Marengo in a similar way by retreating into France. I guess my question here would be, are the changes that are happening here kind of uniquely something that happens in France and then gets exported, essentially something as a matter of necessity as enemies need to adapt? And also, I suppose, if we're saying here that changes in war are the result of changes in politics, I mean, does the necessity of adopting these changes to warfare by other countries like Austria or Prussia result in political changes of their own, kind of going back up the chain?
France is in kind of a unique situation when it comes to the revolution and changes in politics, in that most of the other European states, like Prussia and Austria, they had undergone a lot of these changes peacefully of their own accord. One of the big things in Austria is that under the reign of Maria Theresa and her son Joseph II, is you have much greater like liberation of the peasant from the quote unquote feudal control of the landowners. So for example, like Bohemian serfs were no longer required to perform what's called robot, the origin for the term, the science fiction term, this sort of compulsory forced labor for their landlords. Joseph II had done away with that, and you have this development of the well-ordered police state, as I mentioned earlier, in Prussia and Austria, independently of the French Revolution. And this isn't enough to like put them on parity with the French during the Revolution, because the French do have this more sophisticated approach to war at the strategic level, but it does give them the framework with which they can adapt French methods. In the case of Prussia, you do also have that sort of back up the chain effect, in that it's part of the reform program that the Prussian institute after the massive defeat at Jena. You have the end of serfdom in Prussia, and like the way it's actually executed, it isn't a great deal for serfs trying to strike it out on their own. Like, it never really is. When serfdom gets abolished, like the abolition in Russia during the later 19th century, had similar problems. But it definitely marks a major step in this sort of relation of military and political change.
So I suppose to continue on this idea of, I suppose, the bits we haven't quite covered in much depth, what we talked about mostly is the activities of, I suppose, regular armies, which should be pretty obvious what those were. But of course, I mean, the Napoleonic period is known, at least to some extent through pop culture, for, to some extent, these kinds of guerrilla actions. I mean, just to name a few, you've got Spain or the Tyrol in 1809, or the Partisans of Russia. I mean, how does this kind of fit into the broader pattern of what's happening in terms of nature of warfare?
Yeah, it's really good that you bring that up, because there is this sort of debate within the field about which theaters and which campaigns like really exemplify the changes in warfare during this period. Whether it's the armies in Central Europe, usually under Napoleon personally, the campaign of 1813, 1809, 1806, whether those are the real Napoleonic campaigns, or the guerrilla actions that you see pop up all over the empire during the course of the period. And like Clausewitz, I think, is like one of the most insightful observers of the revolutionary period that there is. And it's really interesting because he very much links the two, in that he sees both the guerrilla insurrection in Spain and the more national campaigns of the great powers in Central Europe as manifestations of the same phenomenon. They're all exemplary of what happens when the people are fundamentally involved in the business of the war, rather than war just being the affair of their rulers. So, he's talking about how the French army under Napoleon has just pulverized everything in its path. Now that Napoleon has hammered out all the imperfections that had, sort of persisted in the French revolutionary armies. But no sooner is he able to do that than the reaction sets in. In Spain, you have this mass uprising of the people. And then, in Austria, the empire resorts to arming the people in a national militia, the Landwehr, that allows them to prosecute the War of 1809 with far greater energy than they ever had before, which eventually ends up leading to Napoleon's first defeat in a major battle, at Aspern. But yeah, this is another thing that I think helps really differentiate the 18th century and Napoleonic period is the role of these irregulars has been massively expanded. They're practically everywhere when you really know how to look for them. Like there's a famous one in Spain and the Tyrol. There's also uprisings in Calabria, along the Rhine during the Revolutionary period, in the Vendée, in northern Italy in 1806. Um, there's constant unrest in Dalmatia. So you have people taking the defense of their area, of their region, into their own hands to a much greater extent than you had seen, practically since the 30 Years' War. And, this is one of the major after effects of the Napoleonic period is you have this much greater emphasis on, the spontaneous defense by the people.
Mm. I guess that it seems as though the Allied powers, or coalition powers, whatever you want to call them, proved quite effective at co-opting these sorts of irregulars, didn't they? With some of the British cooperation with the guerrillas in Spain, or the Prussian use of Freikorps.
Yeah, especially in Spain, it's a very effective combination, sort of a strategic combined arms warfare in a sense, because to effectively combat the insurgency, what the French have to do is they have to spread out and, occupy more and more places to sort of have columns available to root out the guerrillas from their hiding spots whenever they, show themselves. But the thing is, they're also facing a large conventional army, under the Duke of Wellington. And in order to fight a large conventional army, you have to keep your forces concentrated so that, they're available for a battle or a siege or whatever. So the French in Spain, they have this caught between a rock and a hard place. Whether they try to fight the guerrillas effectively by dispersing or fight the British by concentrating. And they're really never able to solve that problem. And as a result, most of the Grande Armée that wins the big battles from 1805 to 1807, the ones that really make Napoleon's name is, what's called the greatest general of modern times. Most of them go to Spain in 1808, and a lot of them never get out. The core of the army goes into Spain, and it stays there, and Napoleon has to keep making new armies for his campaigns against Austria and Russia and later in Germany. So it's very important to the progress of the grander struggle across the many wars.
Yeah, more of a Spanish black hole than just an ulcer. So, I suppose, for the final part, Clausewitz is a name that has come up quite a few times at this point. I suppose, why is Clausewitz so important to all this? I suppose we should start with that.
Well, for the first part, he is able to witness pretty much all of the period, and he's, constantly writing down his observations. And, he's a very sharp guy. So he makes insightful observations, and then he revisits them, and he continues to mentally tinker with them. So he's able to refine his ideas a lot over the course of his life. He starts off as an ensign in the Prussian army in 1793. He's like 13 years old, observing the siege of Mainz in what's now Germany. I think, at the time, it hadn't yet been conquered by the French, so still Germany at that point. But he then, continues. He's there during the Prussian defeat at Auerstadt. He partakes in the Russian campaign. He's in 1813, and he's corps chief of staff in 1815 during the Waterloo campaign. So he sees a lot of combat over his career, and he's constantly, observing and thinking with these ideas. And he's, in touch with a lot of the people at the very leading edge of the Prussian reform movement after the defeat in 1806. So he's very concentrated on the changes in warfare and what has happened over the course of his life that has been so important. And as a result, he's able to produce what people have called the only great book on war. Even in its incomplete form, it's a very insightful text. One of the things a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate about it that I really like is the middle chapters, because of course Clausewitz starts with his book 1 and he continues through to book 8 in a linear fashion. So at the end of this first phase of writing, book 8 is the most up to date in terms of his ideas, because he's constantly playing with them. And like by the end of book 8, you can tell that he sees that some of his original ideas aren't necessarily working, because one of his theories that he had put forward in book 8 is that during the period of the French Revolution, war had achieved this sort of perfection, this sort of absolute form. So he'll say, at the beginning of book 8, Napoleon waged absolute war. He had, perfected, the competence and the energy with which war is undertaken. But then you can see by the end of book 8, he realizes that this isn't really working, because, most wars in history, aren't like the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, these wars to leave the enemy utterly helpless. So, and since his ideas about the basis of theory is that it has to be based in history, he needs to find some theory of war that will fit both the extreme campaigns of the French Revolution and the more moderate ones of earlier periods. So when he goes back to book 1, he's able to refine his idea about the two kinds of war: the war to leave the enemy helpless and the war for a better negotiating position. So these two books are the most important ones for people trying to look for like timeless takeaways from Clausewitz. But as a military historian, I really like the middle books, which deal with the details of strategy, of how battles are fought, how armies are organized, how you go about routine operations, how you do things like cross a river against enemy opposition, how you defend a mountain line, because a lot of these things, they're sort of difficult to distill when you're like just reading campaign histories. So being able to read them in this sort of schematized form that Clausewitz presents in the bulk of On War, I really appreciate. But yeah, it really, in terms of his lasting ideas, these ideas are really still relevant today. Like, one of the big things in the aftermath of the Vietnam War is we started looking to Clausewitz because, as Christopher Bassford, one of the leading Clausewitz scholars, has observed, Clausewitz tends to be very popular after you lose a war. Like the British get really interested in Clausewitz during like the period of the Boer War, where if it's not an outright defeat, it's definitely pretty disappointing on their part. And of course, the Americans, we get really interested in the aftermath of Vietnam. So we start looking through Clausewitz, and it's interesting because like a lot of our takeaways tend to very much reflect our present situation. So in the aftermath of Vietnam, it was very much about the relationship between politics and strategy on the ground that drew people in. But there's always something you can look at in Clausewitz and find something of interest.
Yeah. I suppose, coming up near the end here, Clausewitz, of course, had contemporaries. I suppose is the one thing that really distinguishes Clausewitz is that he also has these broader theoretical ideas. Or is Clausewitz's analysis of the very particular practical things quite different as well, vis-a-vis, say, Gemini is the one who's often remembered as the influence before the American Civil War, or, Archduke Charles of Austria, who also wrote quite prolifically.
Yeah, his ideas regarding like the more concrete issues, oftentimes he'll note that he is definitely, at odds with prevalent opinion. For example, one of the larger ideas about like conventional strategy is the idea of the superiority of the defensive form of war. At the time, there had been a great emphasis on the offensive. In the most extreme example, Napoleon probably only fought a handful of defensive battles in his whole career. Like, he was always on the offensive. So people tended to consider the offensive superior, but Clausewitz makes very, very persuasive arguments for the superiority of the defensive, which put him at odds with many of his contemporaries. So while his contemporaries, oftentimes they do have very sound ideas about war as practiced in their times, a lot of it doesn't translate as well to modern conditions the way Clausewitz's big ideas do.
Yeah, so I feel like big ideas is where we should end this off. So thank you for being on. Thank you for sharing all this with us.
Sounds good.
We may see you on again.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.